Hello there, I'm Dr. Azmain, and welcome to my bedroom, which to be fair is where I spend most of my time recovering after my very first night shifts as a doctor. And that's what we're here to talk about today. In a recent community post, I asked, should I make a video about my first hospital night shift? A grand total of 3 of you commented yes. 1 of you said no. The ayes have it, we're making the damn video. By all accounts, I should probably be asleep right now, except the night shifts have disrupted my sleeping pattern. Just ignore the fact that I sometimes stay up till 3 AM anyway. In case you've been wondering, yes, I do wear the scrubs and stethoscope at all times, even in my sleep, to remind the people in my dreams that I am indeed a doctor. There was that unfortunate incident where this wrapped around my throat in my sleep, but don't worry, I managed to perform CPR on myself and revived myself. It was fine. Live, damn you! For legal reasons, that was definitely a joke. Anyway, let's talk about the night shifts, shall we? Okay, so what did my first night shifts feel like? Well, as you're about to find out, it was a lot to deal with. But I think I handled it pretty well. I was going to film some B-roll footage during my night shift, but A, I was too busy, and B, I didn't want to get fired, lol. So enjoy the stock footage. During the 12-13-hour shift, I hardly had time to take a break. I mean, I did have lunch while reviewing test results and stuff, but it was pretty full on. I got bleeped pretty often by the nurses, so I had to traipse around from one end of the hospital to the other. It's pretty creepy at night, walking through the dark hospital corridors and stairwells. I got in the lifts a couple times by myself, and the doors just opened up and there was no one there. Ooh. I could always rely on my seniors to help me out and give me advice, so that was great. When you're working with someone else, it's great, but otherwise it can get pretty lonely. But yeah, it's definitely a nice feeling when the sun comes up and you feel a little less alone and afraid. Then it's just the normal daytime amount of alone and afraid. Okay, so how does a doctor's night shift actually work? Let me give you the rundown. I somehow lucked out and I've only had to start doing night shifts during this rotation. So I'm on my general surgery rotation currently. Unlike the US, where you pick a specialty straight after med school during the matching program, in the UK you get to rotate through different specialties and try them out before you have to pick one to spend your entire life doing. So for my surgical night shifts, the patients are typically pre-op or post-op. Our night shifts are from around 8 PM to 8:30 AM, but I ended up leaving around 9 AM after finishing everything up. We have a handover at the beginning of the shift, so we know which patients are yet to be seen, which are the sickest, if there are any urgent jobs or scans and stuff to be followed up during the night. We also have a morning handover with the consultants present so that we're all up to date. So our team of night doctors consisted of myself, the foundation doctor going through the different rotations, an SHO, one who's towards the beginning of their specialist surgical training, and a more senior registrar who's in the latter part of their surgical training. We also physically hand over the bleep or pager. Each member of the team has their own bleep they can be contacted with, and each member plays a different role. So my job was mainly to handle jobs on the wards. That includes reviewing sick patients, prescribing certain medications, taking bloods, and putting in cannulas. So the nurses will bleep me to let me know if there's anything they need.
So what's the sitch? Call me, beep me if you wanna reach me.
The SHO's role is to clerk new patients coming in through the door. Clerking means to take a full history, do a physical examination, record your findings in the notes, write down a problem list, and initiate the management plan. Clerking is a single word, but it does a lot of heavy lifting. With surgical patients, they're more likely to present with abdominal pain, nausea, vomiting, something related to that, and we have to figure out what treatment they need immediately and whether or not we should operate. And finally, the registrar's role is more supervisory, to complete paperwork, help the SHO to clerk all the new patients, be on standby in case there needs to be some urgent operations during the night. So how is it different from other hospitals? To be fair, I have done night shifts before, but that was as a medical student, and it's very different shadowing as a medical student compared to actually being the doctor on the wards, running around and having to do all of the jobs. As a medical student, I did an emergency room shift, and that was pretty standard stuff you'd expect to see in the day as well. An acute medicine night shift where patients are freshly admitted from the emergency department. And then there was the labor ward night shift, and that, ladies and gents, deserves a video on its own. So now I've explained how the night shift works, I thought I'd tell you some of the stuff that I actually had to do on the job. So I had to go and review a couple of unwell patients. The nurses will let us know if they think there's something not quite right with them, and I did this using a Dr. ABCDE assessment. Medics love mnemonics, and this one is particularly useful for assessing acutely unwell patients to make sure you don't miss anything. D stands for danger. Is there any electrical wires or spilt blood? R is for response. Is the patient alert, talking, or completely unresponsive? And then you check through for airway, breathing, circulation, disability, and then you expose them to see if there's any rashes or anything like that. You do it in that order because that's what will kill them first. So one of my patients had a fever of 38.2 degrees Celsius. He hadn't slept well. He was having some abdominal pain. He'd had his appendix out a few days earlier. So why was he still having a temperature? I took his blood. I sent off blood cultures to the lab to see if they can grow any bugs in case we need to change up his antibiotics. Another possibility is that an abscess could have developed where the appendix was. And there was another lady with a high heart rate and a high breathing rate. Both of those are kind of worrying. So I looked through the history, I did an assessment, and then I asked the nurses if they would kindly do an ECG, check the rhythm of the heart. I requested a chest x-ray to see if there was anything wrong with the lungs. And I did an ABG, a special blood test from the arteries to see what her actual oxygen levels are like. Finished off by giving her some oxygen and some other medication. I had to sort out some patients with a high blood glucose. They had diabetes, so I had to look at what food they'd eaten, what their regular medications are, have they taken them, and maybe giving them a shot of insulin if their blood sugars are too high. I had to sort out some paperwork, which sounds boring, but it is very necessary. I had to consent a patient who was getting a blood transfusion, so I had to explain why we're giving the blood transfusion, because she was anemic and had a low hemoglobin. Transfusion will help top up her bloods. I had to explain some of the potential risks as well, and what we do to minimize those risks. There was also sadly a patient who had an inoperable condition. The surgeons had tried, but they weren't successful, and so I had to do the paperwork to initiate end-of-life care. That's to ensure that they receive the highest standard of comfort care in their final days. That highlighted to me that it's just as important to know when we should not operate further, because we have to think about the patient's best interests. My bosses had spoken to the patient and their family, and they'd all come to an agreement that this was the best way forward. And apart from that, I obviously had to meticulously document everything I'd done, because if it's not documented, it didn't happen. And then there were the patients with the difficult veins. So the nurses called me up to take blood and put in cannulas on these patients that they hadn't managed to. Keep in mind that the nurses are the experts. They constantly take bloods, put in cannulas, and they are brilliant at it. Meanwhile, I do it less often, let's say. But nevertheless, I was grateful for the experience. So there was a patient on an antibiotic called gentamicin. Now, it's a really effective antibiotic, but it's the bane of every hospital professional's life. You have to do regular blood test monitoring to ensure that it's at the right level, or else if it's too high, it's toxic. It can damage your kidneys and your hearing. So even though the nurses tried 3 times, I somehow managed to find a working vein. I was so chuffed, man. Unfortunately, no such luck with another gentleman whose cannula had stopped working. His veins were basically non-existent, and he needed his IV fluids and antibiotics to get through. Nurses tried 3 times, I tried twice, I had to hand it over to my senior, and even they couldn't do it. So we had to call the anaesthetic doctor, who finally managed it, because the anaesthetists or anesthesiologists in the US are, well, they're basically the experts when it comes to putting in cannulas. And I thought I should mention a common misconception about cannulas or IV drip lines. We use a needle to pierce the skin and guide the little plastic tube into the vein. The plastic tube is what we call the cannula or the venflon. Then we take the needle out and the plastic tube stays sitting inside your vein so that we can put through the IV fluids, antibiotics and other medications. The needle does not stay in your arm. So yeah, I think that went pretty well, all things considered. Like, it could have been a lot worse. It could always be worse. And I had a good team around me, so that's great as well. I've got a few more night shifts soon, so wish me luck. Go watch my first week as a doctor to see how that went. Please like, subscribe, and stay groovy.